We will begin with the land acknowledgement. We respectfully acknowledge the land we're living on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Welcome to our Net Zero Cafe, brought to you by Impact Net Zero. I'm Stephen Poon, and part of the Impact Net Zero team, and your host for this evening. Impact Net Zero is a public outreach initiative on climate change and energy transition with a Canadian perspective. We focus on actions by individuals that can help Canada reach net zero, as consumers making green choices and as citizens exercising civic responsibility in our communities. Net Zero Cafe is a safe space for Canadians to gather and chat about climate change and energy transition to net zero. Each Net Cafe session has a different focus. Tonight, we will talk about the energy transition to a low carbon economy, a view from Alberta. We will hear from a panel of 3 Alberta residents who will discuss the clean energy transition, the role of oil and gas in the province, transition to clean energy, and just transition. The speakers will be sharing in their personal capacity. The views expressed do not reflect those of their employers. Before we go further, some housekeeping rules. If you have questions for any of our panelists, please could you put them into the chat box on the side of the screen. There will be a Q&A session after all the 3 panelists have spoken. And before we bring in the panelists, I'd like to invite Charles Lin to provide the context for our topic. Charles is the founder and lead of Impact Net Zero, or INZ. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Physics and Mathematics from UBC and a PhD in Meteorology from MIT. He retired from a 38-year career as a professor at the University of Toronto and McGill University, and as a Director General in Environment and Climate Change Canada. Charles enjoys reading, walking and cycling, playing bridge, and traveling to visit family and friends. Over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening to all. So I will take a few minutes to provide the context for tonight's session. The session focuses on the energy transition with a view from Alberta. Now, when we talk about energy transition, frequently we hear terms like tons, megatons, gigatons, watts, kilowatts, kilowatt hours, and so on. Part of this vocabulary is inevitable because we are, after all, talking about energy and how to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions due to the various contributors, including energy. But we will go beyond the technical jargon. We will go to the people behind it. People's lives, jobs are impacted in this transition, and this transition will not be easy. And in particular, Alberta, being the heart of the oil and gas industry in Canada, is affected and will be affected significantly. So we will hear from 3 Alberta residents on their own perspectives. Now, the issues that we will talk about is by no means unique to Alberta. Right? Alberta is a major province of Canada, and hence it affects Canada, right? Through the greenhouse gas emissions, through the royalties and tax, and of course through jobs and employment. These issues are also found in the international context. I think we all know that oil and gas is a major player in the transition to net zero internationally. There have been numerous publications from different organizations underlining the challenge behind this task. There's also a big push towards electrification. And one of the panelists will talk about how Alberta is transitioning away from coal to generate cleaner electricity. And a third topic is the just transition. Since the transition involves and impacts workers who are in the oil and gas field, there needs to be mechanisms put in place to help ease this transition. And again, this is found not only in Canada, but also in other countries. And on our website, impactnetzero.ca, we have different postings that help to provide more details. So I'll stop there. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Charles. And so now we move on to the session with the panelists. So we're going to bring them on one at a time. And the first panelist that we have will be Pat Kelly. So Pat holds a BSc in geology from the University of Saskatchewan and a petrophysics certificate from the NEXT program of Tulsa, Oklahoma. He spent 33 years working in various international and domestic petroleum companies, primarily based in Calgary. His various roles as geologist, subsurface team lead, and asset director were focused on the responsible development of oil and gas resources throughout Western Canada. Pat is currently retired and enjoys spending more time with family, traveling, and hiking in the mountains. Pat, this evening, will talk about perspectives on the transition as a retired exploration geologist in the oil and gas sector. Pat, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Stephen. I'm just going to share my screen now and go through some of the learnings and perspectives I have on this. As you mentioned from my bio, my role had been as a project manager, bringing projects forward and doing economics. So it's been quite interesting starting to look at more aspects around the transition, which isn't an area that is completely my expertise, but it's been fascinating to see what's going on that part of the industry. And I'm happy to share some of the learnings and perspectives I have on that. So when talking about the roles of the petroleum industry, as we try to go to a low carbon economy, I guess what I'd want to do first is just kind of share what is the petroleum industry in my view of things. And as I've seen it over the years, we essentially think of it as there's four key players in the industry. So it's not just oil companies. That's where I worked at the oil company with generating economic prospects. But the industry is also made up of what we call service companies. There's specialty services such as drilling, fracking, facility building. And these groups often were key innovators in bringing new ideas, technologies forward to keep the industry vibrant and efficient. But on top of that, we also consider the government regulators as part of the industry. I mean, they ensure the public benefit as we develop the resource. And they're also there to ensure that the resource is developed in a responsible and safe manner. And kind of the fourth pillar we always thought about and worked with was the government-led research. So not that there wasn't research in the oil and service companies, but the government-led tended to look at higher risk technology, more leading edge type of problems. One of the key branches of that research I'd like to point out is Alberta Innovates, and you'll hear more about them as we talk about how this transition is going to take place. They've been a key research and development branch. They were really responsible for unlocking the oil sands many decades ago, and in their current incarnation are going to be critical for the petroleum sector to transition to a low carbon future. And then, of course, the universities have always been there doing the fundamental and in some cases applied research that the industry can use on an immediate basis. So when we talk about where the industry needs to get to a low carbon future, it's useful to talk to it with regard to the types of emissions that the industry generates. So when I was managing projects, we would have emissions from our well sites, from our field sites, our facilities, and the emissions involved with bringing power to those sites. And that's what we call scope 1 and 2 emissions. Those are emissions that we had direct control on, and we could influence to lower those emissions. But there's another type of emission that we'll talk to more later on, the scope 3, which are downstream emissions that we never have control on. So this is when we put gas in our car to run the engine, or we burn natural gas in our furnaces. So that's what we consider scope 3. So as I was working in the industry, a lot of the focus has always been around the scope 1 and 2. And recent legislation from the federal government has focused on that, and the industry is currently responsible for meeting strict criteria on reducing those emissions. So as you're aware, the federal government has implemented guidance around both methane and around carbon dioxide. The carbon tax is really one of the key legislation they've used. But they've also allowed provinces to implement their own specific legislation to meet those targets. And that's really been important, because what we see is that within an industry like the Alberta oil industry, we can have thousands and thousands of sites that have emissions. And so we need legislation that is flexible and cost effective so that we can implement these reductions and changes in a manner that doesn't overly encumber the industry. So the province has implemented that own legislation, and that was really smart policy to allow the local governing agencies to do something that meets their needs. Now, what the federal government has recognized is that, of course, with the 2 greenhouse gases, methane, also you'll hear me refer to as CH4, is the most potent greenhouse gas, 25 times worse than CO2. And the oil and gas sector is responsible for the majority of those emissions. So as a result, the federal government stipulated fairly stringent reduction targets, 45% by 2025, and even more so going into the future. Now, this does introduce significant retrofit costs when we're trying to change out equipment on our well sites and our facilities. That is a costly process. And also even changing our procedures, it reduces flexibility, which increases our costs. But it is viewed as manageable. And the industry on whole, I would say, is on track to hit those targets. On the carbon dioxide side, the targets haven't been as strong. What they implemented was 10% reduction starting in 2020, and that's intended to increase 1% every year. So we are seeing control efforts, and industry again is complying with those efforts to start reducing emissions as we go forward. And as part of this, I mentioned Alberta Innovates. They've been funding a lot of cost-effective technology, particularly because we have so many remote sites. We need technology that can be rolled out into thousands and thousands of sites in a very cost-effective manner. And on the PowerPoint, there's a list of various companies they've funded who have brought forth new technology that can be rolled out into our operations. But one of the main, the single point biggest sources of emissions comes from our oil sands projects. Now, they're different from what we would call the conventional industry. The oil sands are made up with just a few sites with high volume emissions. So it's a very high intensity over a small area. Now, this is a bad thing, but the silver lining to this is that it's possible to capture those emissions and look at opportunities to isolate them underground. And this is why the oil sands industry has really embraced the idea of carbon capture, utilization, and storage, because they can really get a handle on their carbon emissions. And there's been many initiatives over the past on this technology. It is proven technology. And an earlier alliance of the oil sands industry called COSIA, they've done a lot of studies on trying to move this forward. And again, Alberta Innovates, they go up here, they've generated a strategy around this, and they're currently funding more technology to improve the performance of carbon capture and storage. And these activities have allowed a new alliance within the oil sands called the Net Zero Pathways Alliance to commit to achieving net zero by 2050. They are anticipating substantial costs to get there, and so it does require government support. There's no way they could remain commercially viable if they had to spend the amount of capital required to get there on their own. But this support would allow carbon capture start up as early as 2030, and they'll be taking advantage of previous carbon capture projects that have already been implemented in Alberta. And the other benefit of going this road is it also sets the oil sands up to take advantage of other lower zero carbon strategies, including blue hydrogen and direct air capture. And I'll talk about blue hydrogen here a little bit more going forward. At the same time, there's projects taking place. Shell is also planning to decarbonize another one of their refineries, but a key change here is they look to implement that without subsidies. So the goal as we go forward is to require less and less government subsidy as the technology and the efficiency of implementing these improve. So that's a notable change. Another interesting project, and this is more around utilization, Capital Power is looking to decarbonize electricity that they're generating from natural gas by taking the CO2 and converting it to carbon nanotubes. And again, that's based on some of the work that's been taking place over the last decade or so. So there's some exciting things taking place on the scope 1 and 2, but the big challenge for the industry that we see is really around the scope 3. So these are the emissions they don't control. Now, the reality is if we are going to get to net zero by 2050, studies have shown that the demand for Alberta hydrocarbons in general is likely to decrease on the order of 80%. So there's no industry that can survive a 80% destruction in its product demand. So recognizing this reality, the industry is seriously looking to pivot to using hydrocarbon for other purposes. So this has led to two big initiatives. One is called Bitumen Beyond Combustion. And we've talked over the years that how burning these resources is such a waste. I mean, we talked about it 30 years ago that it seems to be such a waste. So now we're starting to realize that, yes, indeed, there are other things we should be doing with it. So Alberta Innovates has identified some great markets for the bitumen, including carbon fibers, asphalt binder. The bitumen actually generates a much superior asphalt when it's used for road building. So it really is.
Pat, I'm sorry to interrupt, but could we ask you to perhaps summarize the rest of your slides so that we could actually try to contain the event within an hour?
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. Thank you, Stephen. So we've seen the bitumen idea of using different purposes. The same thing is happening with natural gas, and really, but the push there is now going to blue hydrogen, where we strip off the carbon from the natural gas and isolate that underground. So the province of Alberta is embracing that in a big way and is supporting it. And there's companies that are already starting to implement these. Air Products in 2024 will start up a blue hydrogen facility in Edmonton, and other companies are doing the same. And going to my last slide, companies are also pursuing other types of energy that does have no emissions. There's an exciting new development in geothermal energy. Geothermal isn't new, but it's typically done in areas with high ground heat flow and often associated with volcanic activity. This company has developed new technology which better extricates the heat from areas where the subsurface temperature is much lower and from any type of rock. So now we have the potential for geothermal energy to be applied widely throughout Canada and throughout the world, for that matter, in many more settings. The other initiatives that include zero energy is clean electrification. There's two Alberta companies trying to produce lithium from oil-filled brines for the battery sector in a much more environmentally and lower cost way. And the oil sands folks are also considering small modular nuclear reactors as their 2050 goal. And finally, there's companies working on biofuels. Suncor's invested in a couple of companies. And of course, Alberta Innovates is working to support almost half a dozen companies doing that. So that's really a very quick overview of the wide range of activities taking place to get to a low carbon future. And we'll hold questions until the other presenters have gone through the material. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Really appreciate that there's a lot of content, and thank you for trying to cover that in the shortest period of time. So now we'd like to move on to our second panelist, and he is James Lin. So James holds a PhD in economics from the University of Alberta and works on electricity policy for the government of Alberta. The views expressed in this webinar does not reflect those of his employer. James's three favorite things in life are meta humor and incomplete lists. You should get that one. Thank you. All right. Now, James will talk about this evening on the transition from coal to natural gas and renewables for electricity generation. Over to you, James.
Thanks, Stephen. So I'm going to talk about Alberta's electricity transition with a focus on what's going to happen to things like natural gas in an Alberta context. So to begin, where does Alberta's electricity come from? So this graph shows exactly that. It goes from the years 2014 to 2021. First thing to notice here are those gray bars, which represent the share of Alberta's electricity that comes from coal. And as you can see, it's been steadily declining from year to year. And this has to do with something that happened in 2015 when the Alberta NDP committed to phasing out coal-fired generation by 2030. And that has led to this steady decline in the share coming from coal. Now, what's been replacing that outgoing coal? So the second thing to notice from this graph are those blue bars, those dark blue bars, which represent generation coming from natural gas. And natural gas is similar to coal. It's also an emitting source, but it's cleaner than coal. And so natural gas has been helping to fill the void that has been left behind by coal generation. And this is much less obvious on the graph, but other sources such as renewables, including wind, which are represented by those green sections, have also been increasing. That's a little bit more obvious in the latter years of this graph. And there's also been a small contribution from solar, which is too small to see here. So the main takeaways from this graph are coal generation has been declining and natural gas generation has been increasing to fill that void. Now there's an additional wrinkle to all this in that over the summer, there was a federal initiative called the Clean Electricity Regulation. So I'm not going to read this text, but I will draw your attention to the highlighted part, which says there is this federal initiative of a net zero electricity grid by 2035. So what does this mean? Well, it means that by 2035, which is about 13 years away from now, any emissions coming from the electricity grid are going to have to be balanced by some form of carbon removals, so that by 2035, the electricity grid on the net will be non-emitting. Now, what does this mean for generation sources such as natural gas, which, as I said, is an emitting source? Well, to understand that, we'll have to understand a little bit about how electricity generation works. So natural gas and coal provide the following things. The first is what's known as base load generation. So this refers to generators that are designed to run 24/7. And so they provide a predictable and steady stream of electricity. Natural gas and coal can also provide what's known as peaking generation. And this refers to generators that can turn on and off as required. And this is going to be useful anytime that there's an increase in demand, such as at dinner time, for instance, when people are making dinner. And then there's that increase in demand, and it is useful to have these generators that can turn on at short notice to meet that increased demand. Now, as we move into a net zero world with increased reliance on renewables such as wind and solar, what does that look like? Well, wind and solar provide what's known as intermittent generation, which means that they can only produce electricity when the wind is blowing or the sun is shining. In other words, Wind and solar do not respond to market conditions, and they do not respond to changes in demand. So what does this mean? Well, this means there's a potential problem in that in a net zero world with this increased reliance on wind and solar, how do we ensure that electricity is available when we need it? Understanding that the hours when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining may not coincide with hours in which we need that electricity. And so there are a few possible technological solutions to this problem, such as, and I'll only give one example here, battery storage, where you could charge the battery when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining, and then discharge that battery when there's an increase in demand. But that kind of technology is very much in the beginning stages, and it's nowhere near the scale that is required in a net zero world. And so that is a potential role in a net zero world for things like natural gas. So, and how that is going to look exactly, to what extent is natural gas going to be featured in a net zero world? That is very much in discussion right now. So it may seem that after all that I've just said, it may seem that it's not easy being green because of all the moving parts and all the different elements that have to be considered. But there is reason for optimism in the sense that the very fact of acknowledging that these challenges exist is in itself a form of progress. And ultimately, that's the objective of these kinds of webinars, is to get people to think about things that they would otherwise not think about. So thank you for listening. Back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, James. Indeed, it's going to be a journey, but yes, we've got to start somewhere. So now let's move on to our third and final speaker and panelist, and he is Brent Kelly. Brent holds a BA and an MA in political science from the University of Alberta and works for the government of Alberta. His current area of focus is employment and labor relations legislation and policy, but has previously worked on different policy areas, including energy, climate change, and environmental regulation. In his spare time, Brent enjoys volunteering for different social justice and environmental initiatives, spending time online and in person with friends and family, and hiking in the mountains. The views expressed do not reflect those of his employer. So Brent this evening will share about the explanation of just transition and personal actions as a concerned Albertan. Over to you, Brent.
Awesome. Thank you very much for the introduction, Stephen, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here today and to present. I appreciate that very much. Oh, sorry about that. I'm here in my office, and I think the automatic lights just turned off, but they turned on again. Sorry about that. Please excuse me. So let me just go ahead and share my screen so you folks can see. Perfect. You folks can see that? Awesome. Okay. All right. Well, again, yeah, thanks very much for the introduction. As mentioned, my name is Brent. I work for the government of Alberta currently in labor relations policy, but I've had the pleasure of working in climate change policy with James previously. And just to clarify, Patrick is in fact my dad. So I've worked in climate change policy. My dad has worked in oil and gas. As you can imagine, lots of interesting conversations have been had at the dinner table over time. So let me just start my timer here. Perfect. So I'm going to talk to you today, as Stephen mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about just transition and talk about some of the actions I've taken. I've had the opportunity to take in my role as a public employee of the government of Alberta, but also personal actions that I've taken in my union activism, which I'll talk about later. So just transition. What is a just transition? Well, some of you folks may have heard a little bit about just transition before, others perhaps not, but I'll try to give a really brief and high-level overview of what it is. So it's associated with the Green New Deal, popularized in discussions coming out of the United States. The Green New Deal is basically how are we going to take on the generational challenge that is climate change. What are we going to do about it? And sort of a generational problem requires a generational response. And that's where the terminology Green New Deal has come from, borrows from the New Deal, which of course was a major sort of governmental societal response to the Great Depression. So, to solve the Great Depression, New Deal; to solve climate change, Green New Deal. So as part of a Green New Deal, that entails major economic and societal transition. We know that climate change is a huge problem, so we're going to require a lot of changes. So, how are we going to manage the changes that are going to come to the economy, to the lives and livelihoods of folks that work in the oil and gas industry? As Pat mentioned, oil and gas industry may be looking at some pretty major, up to 80% reductions in some of these emissions, right? How are we going to manage those changes? That's essentially what a just transition is all about. It's ensuring that the changes that happen in society and the economy are in a planned and a thoughtful way that ensure that everybody, including folks that currently work in carbon intensive industries, have the opportunity for full and equal and equitable participation in the economy, in the decarbonized economy of the future. Right. So, but I should note there are different perspectives on what it is and what it should entail. Some perspectives on a just transition focus more just simply on making sure that there's a plan for the economic transition. Other perspectives emphasize sort of social justice opportunities and initiatives and things like that. So just to put that out there as a point of clarification. One of the key elements of a just transition is how can we maximize economic opportunity while minimizing the human cost, right? So again, we want to be creating these new jobs. We want to be investing in innovation. We want to be providing these opportunities for retraining and things like that, minimizing the potential negative human impacts of a transition to a greener economy. So one thing that I might draw your folks' attention to, and I'm going to paste a link to this in the chat if I may, I'll paste it later. There's a report that the Alberta Federation of Labor recently came out with. It's called "Skate to Where the Puck is Going," and it's basically talking about how do we get Alberta to that clean energy future. So I'll share that link later, but they talk a lot about the idea of a just transition. They make reference to some legislation that's come out of the United States called the Inflation Reduction Act, which is kind of the United States' kind of smaller version of a Green New Deal, and it incorporates lots of elements of a just transition. So if you're curious about what it means, I would definitely draw your attention to that, and I'll post a link to that report later, because it really goes into great detail all about that. So what might that look like? So James and Pat have already talked about a lot of different kinds of programs and policies and innovation approaches that will feed into a just transition. But basically, a just transition is going to require massive public and private investment to create the new low carbon economy of the future. So Pat mentioned a lot of the different Alberta Innovates programs, talking about the Technology Innovation and Emissions Reduction Program, which provides funding for innovation in carbon intensity reduction and things like that. But there's also going to need to be industrial policy. So we're going to need to see state intervention. We're going to need to see, as the Alberta Federation of Labor report suggests, we're going to need to see the reintroduction of the entrepreneurial state, right? Because as Pat mentioned, when targeted research is focused on innovation, we can have things like, for example, oil sands. We can make progress in oil sands development, things like that, or carbon capture and sequestration. We need to be doing more of that, and we need to be targeting it not only in safe bets, but also in blue sky research, where the payoff might not be as guaranteed, but that's the kind of research that we need to be doing to lay the foundations for that carbon reduced economy of the future that will provide those jobs for not only folks that used to work in more carbon intensive industries, but also for folks that don't work in those sectors as well. So a really key element in the how of how that happens is engagement and involvement of the affected parties. And so, a just transition entails involvement of, folks that work, in carbon intensive and climate change emissions intensive industries, ensuring that they have, a voice at the table. They have the opportunity to participate and to provide input into what that transition will look like, right? It's not something that should be imposed. It's something that has to involve all of the affected parties, because this ultimately climate change is a challenge that we all have to address together. So, sorry, please, I just need to take a drink of water. I'm just getting over a cold, so please bear with me. Yeah, so as mentioned, there's already lots of different programs that are underway that will feed into a just transition. But there's lots more opportunities out there. And so that's I think what we need to be looking into, and that's what I think we should be excited about. So finally, I'll talk a little bit about how I've had the opportunity to sort of advocate for a just transition, both in my work and in my personal sort of union activism. So as an employee of the government of Alberta, I am a member of the Provincial Employees Union, the Alberta Union of Provincial Employees. And about 2 years ago, at a union convention, there were resolutions introduced about a just transition and a Green New Deal. And these, of course, came together and they were discussed sort of together. And I had the opportunity to speak in favor of those resolutions. And I was really pleased to see that they passed. They passed with very strong support, 80+% support for both resolutions. And now you have to be mindful that the people attending this convention are Alberta public employees. So these are peace officers, correctional officers, environmental protection officers, some healthcare workers, policy folks like myself. So you have a wide variety of Alberta representation of folks from across Alberta. And the resolutions in favor of a Green New Deal and in favor of a just transition passed overwhelmingly. So I guess I want to, if I could leave you with anything, it's that, people are aware the climate change is an issue. It's an issue that needs to be addressed, and they're excited to take action about it. So I was, as I say, I was pleased to be able to speak in favor of those resolutions at that union convention. I was pleased to see them pass. So in previous roles in government, as I mentioned, I've had the opportunity to work on policy relating to just transition. So I previously worked in energy efficiency and climate change adaptation, introducing the Clean Energy Improvements Program. Basically, that's a program that would allow energy efficient and clean energy retrofits to homeowners, to residences and institutions and things like that. And one of the things that really stood out for me as we were working on the developments and implementation of that was how excited people were about the opportunity to participate in that program. Obviously, the businesses that would be doing those retrofits, but universities, hospitals, municipalities were really excited to partner with us on this. So, when we're thinking about the just transition, when we're thinking about the clean economy of the future, we have to remember how much opportunity there is there. There's opportunity for investment. There's opportunity for a new economy, and we need to seize that. We need to work towards that. And then finally, as mentioned, I currently work on labor relations policy and sort of workforce policy. And one of the things we're doing as we are preparing for an upcoming provincial election in Alberta is we're taking the time to think about what are the opportunities that policymakers, that decision makers need to hear about? What are some opportunities for programs to help ensure a just transition, right? And so those are some of the things that we're thinking about now. So anyways, I appreciate we're running out of time here, but that's a little bit about a just transition, kind of a crash course, high level information about it, as well as some of the things that I've had the pleasure of working on. Yeah, so anyways, thanks again for the opportunity. Appreciate the chance to share with you all.
Thank you, Brent. And again, I know it's quite a challenge. There's a lot of content there, and I appreciate the just transition really brings in the social dimension, which actually gives a more holistic view to the whole issue that we have, right? Maybe that's a segue for us to now move into the Q&A session. So we've got some questions here. Some of them are questions that we've also kind of like thought about as well, including for those which are put from the floor. So let us start, and we will start with questions for Pat. So Pat, we have the following questions for you. Are we on track to hit our low carbon target? And what do you see as the biggest barriers to rapidly achieving net zero from the petroleum industry?
Thank you, Stephen. I mean, I would say, it's been an educational experience for me in the last couple of weeks. I've always been interested in the topic. So researching this and just seeing the vast array of activity that is taking place, both federally and provincially, and actually the alignment between federal and provincial. I mean, we tend to see a lot of newspaper headlines and stuff which reflect a certain position, but the reality, when I started looking at the programs that are in place and what's being implemented, there's actually a lot of alignment. So in general, I get the sense that we are on track, that there is a lot of good policy out there, but there are some specifics that kind of caught my eye when I was thinking about how this is going to work going forward. For the large oil sand companies, what they're doing, the net zero 2050 is very aggressive, but I mean, with good focus and government support, yes. Can they meet it? I think it's possible. We just have to be careful. There's proposals to increase the reductions by 2030 to 42% reduction, and I've heard comments from industry, and as my experience in the industry, that may be overly aggressive. But the good news is the federal government is consulting on these kind of things. So, because you run the risk of getting too harsh and we start offshoring emissions. So being on track in my mind is both not going too fast and not going too slow. So I think in that area, it seems like it's good. The one thing I was concerned about when I was reading this, I talked about the scope 3. So that's essentially the erosion of demand in the future. And as I looked at some of the projects, I was thinking, gee, I'm not sure if we're moving fast enough. I would like to see us redoubling efforts around scope 3 to ensure that we have these alternatives in place sooner, so that industry actually has a vision to the future. And that applies, of course, both to the oil sands and to the gas. The same thing in the natural gas, getting blue hydrogen moving. Are we moving fast enough? I'd like to see projects going forward. And to partly answer the question, what are the barriers? It was interesting reading about the Suncor and the ATCO project, because we saw that one was out to 2028. And one of the things they talked about as a barrier was just policy. So government policies, like who owns the resource? How does the process work? So, I mean, as a barrier to going faster, I think is government has to keep up. Because we saw the one company is ready to go ahead in 2024 in a certain constraint, but in other situations, it's not so clear cut. So we've got to address policy issues. One thing that I do also wondered about, like the tier program, and you saw on my slide how they talked about a 10% reduction in 2020 and increasing 1% a year. That one actually caught my eye because that was so much lower than the methane, and rightly so. But I do wonder if, particularly during this period of high prices, because we don't know how long high prices will last, is are we being aggressive enough during periods of high prices to start to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions? So that one kind of caught my eye. Maybe we're not doing all we can there. And then certainly the one thing that also caught my eye was methane. I mean, I was looking at the numbers. Once the oil and gas industry has reduced its emissions by 75%, that still leaves 2/3 of the methane emissions in place from other industries. So the current policy really is not targeting those emissions nearly as aggressively. So that certainly to me is a concern that we need to be getting on track with that. And certainly other things, imported petroleum, is that subject to the same standards that we're looking for in our own industries and products, right? That we're importing, other products we import. So I haven't seen much on that space, so that gives me a concern. A few other comments. So, I mean, I've talked about the technology, as far as barriers to moving faster. Technology, I think, is out there. We are doing a ton of stuff, but I mean, the question I would say, have we put to some of the groups we're supporting, what would it take for you to go twice as fast? I mean, are those types of questions being asked, and is the funding in place to support that? So I think we need to really be looking at that a bit more. So anyway, that's probably the key things that caught my eye in thinking about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Indeed, there's quite a lot of moving targets for this, but good to know that some of the things are still on track. So let's move on to our second panelist. And so this will be James. James, the question for you is, what is the role? I'm sorry, let me start it again. What role will natural gas play in the world of net zero electricity?
Thanks, Stephen. So I mentioned the difference between what natural gas can provide and what renewables can provide, and how renewables simply do not provide that base load and peaking capacity. So right now, very much will depend on how technology evolves. So I mentioned battery storage. So technologies like that, what stage will they be at in 2035? And that is going to, in large part, determine whether natural gas is going to play a big role or a small role in 2035. But the way it's looking is that it is unlikely that natural gas is going to go completely away, because we will need that base load, that peaking capacity that it provides. Now, how much of a role, that remains to be seen. And I'll quickly address one of the comments I see in the chat here about how renewables haven't grown as fast. The chart I showed went up to 2021. Once we see the 2022 data, I think there would be more obvious growth in renewables. Thanks.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you, James. Now to Brent. So Brent, we have a few questions which we thought we'll just lump together and so put it to you in one shot. So the question we have is, how is Alberta balancing its fight against climate change with a just transition? What are the risks if not enough action is taken to ensure a just transition to net zero in Alberta? And what might Alberta look like in a net zero future where a just transition wasn't planned for and didn't happen in the province? Sorry, that's quite a bit, but
no, it's all good. Thanks very much, Stephen. I appreciate the opportunity. So regarding the first part, how is Alberta balancing its fight against climate change with just transition? I think there's lots of progress being made, as we saw from James and Pat's presentations. There's lots going on. You know, both here in Alberta and Canada and globally, right? There's lots of action, you know, being taken against climate change. But we know that more needs to be done, right? The research that we're seeing, you know, is showing us very clearly that we're not taking enough action fast enough, right? So we know that more needs to be done. So, but the good news is there is lots happening, and there's lots we can learn from both here in Alberta and elsewhere in the world. So we just need to continue pushing. What are the risks if not enough action is taken? Well, in Alberta, I think one of the most obvious risks is fiscal risks, right? A very significant portion of the provincial budget comes from, you know, resource royalty revenue, right? Oil and gas development, you know, carbon intensive industry revenue. And, you know, if that shrinks majorly, that's going to have a big impact on our budget. I mean, it already does. When the price of oil goes down in Alberta, everybody knows budget cuts are coming, right? It's just the way, it's just a reality of the fiscal budget of Alberta, the provincial government. So that's a big one. But obviously there's standard of living risks. You know, what are we going to do to ensure that the standard of living in this province is just as high as it is now, right? In the absence or as the economy changes, right? That's another big risk. And there's also a demographic risk. You know, if we lose some of that standard of living, if we lose that revenue, are we also going to lose young folks that want to work in those industries and enjoy those livelihoods and you know, build families here? And what might Alberta look like in a net zero future when a just transition didn't happen? Well, I would worry it would be less dynamic than it is now, less youthful, less exciting, not as great a place as it is right now to live. Still, I think it would be a great place to live, but not as good as it could be. And that's why a just transition and a planned transition is so important to ensure that. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thanks.
Thank you, Brent. Indeed, it's quite a challenge, but let's hope and cross our fingers that it will all work out in the end. Our next question goes to both Pat and Brent, and this from one of the our audience here, and the question is similar to the first question for Pat. How realistic would it be for Canada? I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Similar to the first question for Pat, how realistic would Canada reach the ambitious goal of net zero by 2050 from Alberta's current perspective?
Can I go first?
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I would elaborate slightly on, my response. Are we on track? As I highlighted, there are a lot of areas where good things are happening at the pace we probably need, but they're by no means a slam dunk. But I also did, in my view, see some areas that would concern me a little bit, for my kids and my grandkids. It's like, are we handing them a better future? So I did point out to some of the scope 3 activities and what we're doing there. I don't think that's fast enough in my mind. I think, we need something to jump us another 5 years to get that stuff going, these zero energy fuels. So I do see a lot more on that end. And so it's a fair question. Are we going to get there from here to there? There's a lot that has to happen. That's a legitimate question. I think we need our politicians and our policy people looking a little bit harder at how much faster we can go in bringing forth the technology and having the policies in place, because a lot of the industry, like you say, is ready to go. We're seeing projects being put in the ground, but it needs to be faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I would echo that. I mean, I think, again, the research that we're seeing shows that we aren't moving fast enough to reach our climate change goals, right? Report after report is suggesting this. And so we need bold action, we need visionary leadership. And climate change is it's a technological problem, it's an economic problem, but it's a political problem, I think, in my opinion, above all else, because it requires us to have the hard conversations about what are we going to do. And that requires, concerted effort from all of us for a long time. So yeah, more needs to be done. Lots is already being done, but we know that more needs to be done. So thank you.
Can I add a comment?
Yeah, go ahead.
What I would say is this really is the Apollo project of our generation. And we are definitely reallocating the resources, but nothing near what they did for the Apollo program. We are rebuilding our whole energy supply system, which underpins our standard of living. We can't afford to get this wrong. So, I mean, as much as obviously climate change is, one of the #1 intergenerational issues, getting it right is associated with part of that. So, yes, I think we need more to be done. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for painting the somber tone to this, but indeed it is a very serious issue. So the next question is back to you, Brent, and perhaps Pat. And the question is, how are the skills of oil sands industries different or similar to the renewable energy? And has there been any success or examples of reskilling or upskilling that actually work?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So I'm not an expert in this particular subject, but what I can say, what I have seen is that there are areas where there are opportunities in terms of re-education, reskilling. There are transferable skills from lots of different areas that work, lots of different employees in oil and gas industries, but it is going to require investment. And there may be instances where some of these skills don't transfer, right? But that's why that underscores the importance of a planned transition, right? Because we need to be targeting the areas where there are transferable skills that we can quickly adapt to new different fields and industries, but we need to address the areas where that may not be the case, right? Where skill sets are too specific, or knowledge is too is too specific. So I'm, like I said, I'm not an expert in that, but I do know there are opportunities. The Alberta Federation of Labor report that I mentioned does speak to that a little bit more, those specific areas where there are some opportunities, but it is potentially a challenge for some groups, for sure.
And
Thank you, Brent.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you, Brent. And Pat, do you want to chime in as well?
Yeah, just briefly, if I heard the question properly, if it was specifically saying oil sands versus renewables, in my mind, I'm thinking oil sands versus wind and power. My general sense is that those specifically would have somewhat limited transferability. There would be a lot of retraining required, and the people are clearly capable of being retrained for those industries. But as it stands, yes, limited transferability, some power systems, controls, those kind of things, sure. Really, I guess where I look at the transferability is when we take an oil sands industry and convert it. I mean, there's more transferability when we pivot the industry from just combustion to products, because now the people are retained. They're doing some of the same works, but the market for the products is vastly different. And it's still zero. We're still looking for zero carbon, but it's a whole new industry. So it's creative destruction taking place there. Same for natural gas. You can pivot all those skills if you go from natural gas to blue hydrogen. I mean, now all of those jobs and those people, they carry on, but you're doing a clean energy at that point. So I think that's where there's a lot more transferability. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. So we are coming quite close to the top of the hour. And so we have one final question, and this will be addressed to all three of you, right? And so the question is, if you have just one message to Canadians outside of Alberta, what would that message be? Right? I'll repeat that. If you have just one message to Canadians outside of Alberta, what would that message be? And I would like to invite James to start the ball rolling.
I would say my message is there are a lot of different people in Alberta, and it's very easy to, not just for Alberta, but in general, it's very easy to paint everyone in the same brush. But I think it's important to remember that not everyone is the same here. There is a wide variety of opinions, and the types of people, if you're on a certain side, you will find people espousing those same views here in Alberta, no matter what that view is. So thank you.
Thank you. Right. Pat, would you like to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I guess mine is around the creative culture in Alberta and the acceptance. So it's kind of similar to James, but Alberta is really a melting pot. I mean, the industry is undergoing creative destruction, but it's faced obstacles before. I mean, the industry is open to people from across Canada. We've got, when I was working in the office, I had people from almost every province and at some points every continent of the world. It's a very welcoming culture. It's open to anybody who has the best ideas from the universities, from any gender, race, you name it. I've had very diverse teams working under me. And it's that diversity that I think, as we undergo this creative destruction, I think I'm certain that we will be successful. There will be failures for sure, but there will be as many new ideas coming through that will allow us to be successful to getting to zero carbon. Is it going to be exactly 2050? I don't know. But the capability is there, and I'll just invite anybody who's interested in helping, because Alberta innovates, accepts projects from any university, any group across Canada. So it is an inclusive culture for solving problems. and I am certain we will succeed. And I think Alberta will absolutely be relevant, you know, as we go forward in a low carbon economy. The creativity and the drive is here, and we invite people to join us.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Brent?
Yeah, I guess I would echo what Pat said in that, you know, to the rest of Canada, let's continue to work together to fight climate change and ensure a just transition to the clean economy of the future. Let's work as we can to be, you know, to be leaders in that transition, to invent the technologies that help make that happen. Climate change isn't just an Alberta problem. It's not even just a Canada problem. Climate change is a global problem, and we have to work together, you know, in this province, in this country, and internationally to fight that and to ensure, you know, to ensure an equitable, you know, future that is also decarbonized. So let's continue to work together. Let's invent those solutions of the future in partnership. And yeah, I think we can do it. We've got lots of bright, hardworking, well-educated people here in Alberta and in Canada. And I think if we really, you know, put our heads down, work hard, you know, tackle that you know, that generational problem, that Apollo program of our time. If we work together, I don't think there's anything we can't accomplish. So let's do it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Brent, for, you know, for all this. So now I'd like to move on to our final segment, which is actually inviting Charles for the closing remarks. Charles?
Thank you, Stephen. And thank you to this panelists for some very engaging discussion points. And I think one message that we can take back from all this is that this is a very difficult problem, right? And there are no easy solutions. There are no silver bullets, and it's difficult at all levels, right? At the technological, economic, and political levels, as Brent has noted as well. But there's also the feeling that we can do this, but we have to do it together. We are all in this together, right? As Albertans, as Canadians, and even as global citizens. So it is a difficult task. We have made a start, which is nowhere enough to get to the end point. And whether we get to the end point and how we get there is a little bit of an unknown. Right? It's difficult to, for example, predict technological innovations years and decades in advance. But the conversations have started, you know, in forums like this that could be difficult at times, right? And that's no reason to not have these conversations. So to show the difficulty, let me just finish by talking about a New York Times interview of Stephen Guilbeault, our environment minister. And we will put the link to this interview in our website in a few days. It's a New York Times interview of him, and he is an environmental activist in his previous life. The interview starts by noting that he had scaled the CN Tower as an environmental activist 20 years ago. Right? And then he was promptly arrested after he descended. And the reporter asked him, how many times have you been arrested? And he said 4 times. He also worked for Greenpeace. Now he's the most senior Canadian administrator responsible for the environment portfolio. And a couple of months ago, he just approved a controversial decision, the Bay du Nord offshore drilling off Newfoundland and Labrador, which allowed certain companies to start the offshore drilling. So the reporter asked him, how do you manage this, right? Going from an environmental activist who's been arrested 4 times to approving a controversial drilling project. And he said it was the most difficult decision that he had to make. He had many replies from his environmental friends, which all said, we don't agree with your decision, but we understand how you made it. We understand that you had to make a tough decision. And he said he didn't lose any of his friends from the environmental sector. So all this to say, it is a difficult task, but we are good at solving difficult tasks. Canada as a country and the different provinces, in particular Alberta. Right? Canada is a rich country and we have good people. And if we put our heads together, we can make progress in this. Okay. So I'll stop there. And Stephen, thank you for being the host for tonight's session. And again, thanks to all the panelists as well.
Thank you. So this brings us to the end of the Net Zero Cafe. I hope you found the session informative and sufficiently engaging. And again, thank you for all the panelists. We welcome you to visit our INZ website, impactnetzero.cafe. And finally, do stay tuned for our next Net Zero Cafe. Have a good evening.
So that's impactnetzero.ca. Yes. Okay.